Hi, welcome to the Metaphysical Hour. I'm your host, Rory Colgan. I'm excited to be here and to be speaking to you wherever you are on this planet, whatever day, whatever year this happens to be. This is our fourth episode, and as I've said, I'm excited about tonight's topic. One of our format elements at this point in our evolution is to be about 10 minutes long, because essentially it's just a little monologue of me. It's me talking. And I'm sure no matter how insightful I am, I can become pretty boring pretty quickly. So I don't want to be here talking to you for too long without your input. And so at some point in the future, we're definitely going to have guests, but we're just kind of starting from the scratch, and we'll get there eventually. So tonight's topic is something that you could say, extremely interested in. I'm interested in this topic because a lot of different reasons. One, I'd like to live in a world that is relatively free from violence. That is saying a lot. We live in a world, man, where everything seems to be competitive and non-cooperative. And what I postulate, what I put forth, is that there is something called the violence virus, and it's propagated in certain environments, just like any virus is propagated in certain environments. And this particular violence, comes through acts of violence. Now, another way of putting that is that violence begets violence. Maybe something that you've heard. So that the old notion of an eye for an eye is no longer a valid approach. And a lot of people say, well, of course not. You've heard Gandhi's quote, an eye for an eye makes the world blind. And a lot of other people have said that as well, and I don't even know if he originated it. Point being, in our consciousness and in our collective consciousness, there is a strong thought about how violence doesn't solve anything. Then if you get into politics, I guess things change because most of the politicians like violence. They approve of violence in certain situations. And, of course they'll say with a straight face that, well, this is our, last resort. If, people are terrorists, then they need to be dealt with, and sometimes the justice comes with violence. And I'm not going to jump into that little hodgepodge of weird things yet. I'm going to stay on a very sacred position or a sacred place and not get my hands dirty yet with perhaps policy and the government and some of the factions within the government, some of the policies within the government. Today I'm going to focus simply on where the violence virus comes from, and therefore how to heal it, how to correct it, how to decrease the likelihood that violence is so prolific. You could probably make an argument that we're becoming less violent as a species, and I would probably agree with that. I also know of, through technology, a lot of violence that is still happening throughout the world. And, it happens in the streets of Denver, as well as the streets of Mexico City, as well as in Syria and Iraq, Israel and Palestine, and Nigeria, and all sorts of interesting places on this planet. Violence is certainly something that most of us have grown up with. Now, I happen to be pretty fortunate in the sense that I grew up in a place that didn't have domestic violence. My parents did not fight. Maybe I was spanked a few times, but they were pretty few and far between. So I didn't develop a whole lot of scar tissue in the sense that I'm going to listen to quote unquote the authority because the authority is going to spank me. Because that's one of the things that you communicate. I'm bigger than you. I can make your life miserable. And, conveniently enough, that's kind of sometimes the position the government ends up in. But of course they say, well, you've elected us and it's democratic and, these are just the rules and we all have to obey it. These rules, because without these rules, we would all have chaos. And, again, that's a topic for another day. Today, like I said, I'm very fortunate in the sense that I grew up with very little violence, and I reflect in my throughout my family tree, and my particular parents and my grandparents, and then their parents, so all the way back to my great-grandparents, no male was in a war. They just happened to be too young, too old, in the case of my father, too asthmatic to go over to Vietnam and kill people, more than likely, or be killed, one of the two, or maybe a mixture of both. So I grew up in a family that was at least 3 generations, maybe 4 generations removed from violence. Now, my parents, waited until later in life to have children, and then definitely on my mom's side, her parents were in their 40s. This is in the 1950s before they had children. So they, were born in like 1908, 1913, 1907, and I think there was another one that was born in the teens. So right around World War I. So my grandparents were born as children during World War I. And World War II, they were just either a little too old for the draft or a little too young still, or female. And then again, as I said with my father, he was not drafted into NAM simply because of his asthmatic condition. And I feel very fortunate for that. That got me thinking, how long does it take to get violence out of one's genetic makeup? And I'm not saying that this is true, objective. I'm just using this antidote, this story, to give an example. That if the violence were to stop today, the virus would still go on for 3 or 4 generations. Why? Because when you drop a bomb on a house that actually didn't have any terrorists in it or any militants in it, and your father was killed, you as a 14-year-old boy are now impressionable, and you will hear the story in the street. You'll also know the fact that your father is dead and that your house is demolished. So that's going to create a ripple. Not to say that that child will become a militant in opposition of the people that dropped a bomb on the house, but it is a higher likelihood. Or that child might then have greater sympathy for violence and recognize that it is indeed a normal and natural thing to have. So exposure to violence, just like exposure to any virus, creates a reality where the child or the person that's exposed to it becomes more susceptible to it, and hence it becomes just like a virus that we would think of when we think of our bodies. So violence is a virus, and I'm not naive enough, I know some metaphysicians might be a little bit more naive or perhaps more positive minded, that if all the bombs stopped dropping today, all the guns stopped shooting today, which is 98.7% certain not going to happen, there would still be violent impulses for at least 3 or 4 generations before we would get beyond those ripples, and perhaps for decades, or not decades, but dozens of generations to come. So this gives us a practical view at long-term approaches to violence, that you cannot correct violence with more violence. And the Dhammapada, one of the Buddhist scriptures, if you will, or holy works, or most important books if you don't think of it as a religion, it states that in verse 1, the twin verses, that hatred will not end hatred, love alone will. And that can be applied directly to foreign policy, to what our politicians say and do. So, I encourage you to, if you do think, not necessarily as a pacifist, but as a peaceful person, as a loving person, that's something that you should write your congressfolk, and perhaps even the president, whether he'll listen or she'll listen in the next election, if that's what happens, is still to be seen. Point being, you have a voice and make that voice heard, because if you are not susceptible to the violence virus, then your antibodies, if you will, your words, your thoughts can actually cause there to be a different within the collective consciousness. And so I highly encourage you, if you are free of the violence virus, to share the practicality of tolerance, of acceptance, of asking good questions, at looking at good policy and bad policy and shoring up some of that policy. And again, I'm not going to get too political with this particular conversation. Right now I just want to focus on that metaphysical component, which is that if you are already immune to the violence virus, that you need to shine your light and allow that energy to pour out of you. If you have the tendency to get into violence, one of the reasons why is that one of the things that's weak in your spiritual immune system is a sense of fear. And that means that if you're afraid of your life, you'll stop reasoning, you'll stop thinking, you'll stop thinking things through, and you'll be led by the nose a lot easier. So you have to end the fear of death. How do you do that? Well, in metaphysics, we learn how to go beyond the physical. We learn to go into the inner levels of consciousness and to associate our consciousness, our very being, our sense of aliveness, to something that permeates for a longer duration than just the physical form. So if you still are susceptible to violence, I know this is a big pill to take, you have to become more aware of your eternal nature and how you exist beyond the physical, so that you lose the fear of death, and then you can think things through when something is presented to you, as opposed to reacting and then being sorry a decade later because of your reaction spawning the violence virus. This is Rory Colgan from the Metaphysical Hour. Hope you learned something. Please comment, please subscribe. In a day or two, so if you're listening to this outside of today or tomorrow, I should have it up on Inner Health Today, a link where you can donate some monetary gifts. If you like what I'm putting out and want to see the good times keep on coming through the internet. Be blessed, you all. All right, bye.